This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Warren, as we talk about the stories of this week from a Christian worldview, it's really interesting. There's this kind of ominous threat that's kind of been hanging out there for decades. And I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about decades, but it's called the Equality Act. And I think really a lot of folks believed that really it was a non-starter. It was going to be really hard to kind of get that through Congress. But it's just interesting. A lot more people are talking about, well, you know, still that it's a long shot, and that it's a grave threat to religious liberty if it ever passed. But I guess it seems to have moved from the category of non-starter to the category of slight possibility, but it's worth talking about, I think.
Yeah, I think so. The Equality Act, for people who are not up to speed on it, is, I think, John, it'd be fair to characterize it as an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to expand it, though, pretty dramatically to include LGBT people. And I think one of the reasons that you said it was a non-starter was because, you know, the vast majority of mainstream the Human Rights Campaign, a lot of pro-gay groups support it, but the vast majority of mainstream organizations do not until this week. And I think that is what has moved the needle a little bit, maybe what you're thinking. The United States Chamber of Commerce has said that they may be in favor of the Equality Act.
Yeah, and that is a big deal. So, yeah, just to be clear, what the Equality Act does is that it takes the provisions of the Civil Rights Act, and again, these were provisions essentially to provide public accommodations for African Americans and minorities who were experiencing kind of widespread discrimination. And it's one of those times in history, I mean, there's a lot of things to say about this. One of the times in history in which politics needed to be upstream from culture. Most of the time you get the politics you deserve from culture, for better or for worse. This was one where culture wasn't ready for it, but it was, but because of the leadership of Dr. King and so many other civil rights leaders, it was like, look, we cannot allow this sort of widespread discrimination that essentially prevents African Americans who are full citizens from being fully included in American society. And you know, there was just a movie about this called The Green Book. You know, The Green Book was a book that allowed African American travelers to make it across the country both safely and also to know which hotels would serve them and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What the Equality Act would do is it would take the categories of sexual orientation and gender identity and elevate them to the same category as race. Now, in some ways, this has been the argument all along. This has been done culturally in a lot of ways, but it hasn't been done legally in this sort of kind of wide sweeping way. And of course, I think the concern for religious liberty is there's not the same level of widespread discrimination against LGBT individuals. They're not prevented from participating in everyday life. There's nowhere near that sort of level. But more than that, that enshrines anyone who has a traditional view of sexual morality. It enshrines anyone, just like it enshrines this, you know, sexual orientation and gender identity at the same level as race. It enshrines any dissent from that to the same level as the KKK and neo-Nazi white supremacy. And so, in other words, it just kind of preempts any sort of conversation or debate between, you know, the rights of individuals to have religious beliefs or just deeply held beliefs and this agenda that goes along with sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah, you know, John, to me, too, this is kind of a classic example of something that you talk about all the time and we talk about at Breakpoint a lot, which is that this idea of words matter, that we often will use the same vocabulary but have different definitions. Because if you sort of cut away the Equality Act, really what it does is redefine 2 or 3 key words. Instead of sex, meaning male and female, it also includes a sex stereotype, sexual orientation, gender identity, and it also redefines the word sexual orientation and gender identity. Gender identity, for example, could also include appearance, mannerisms, or characteristics, regardless of the individual's assigned sex at birth. So, you know, this is a great example of words matter, and that we not only have to have the same vocabulary, but we have to have the same common cultural understanding of words if we're going to have serious political discourse in this country.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's one of the issues I think that really matters. is that redefinition of words and then just kind of enshrining them. It just kind of preempts any sort of debate. And one of the things that we've seen, even Justice Kennedy, who gave us same-sex marriage, the very next term gave us the decision in Masterpiece. He clearly didn't want Obergefell to preempt the whole decision. He wanted culture to respect alternative opinions and to kind of fight it out. And that's one of the differences I've seen between the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973, which was a sweeping decision in terms of abortion rights, but it did not dismiss from society anyone who disagreed. And this is what this does. And so it is a dramatic kind of nuclear option, a game changer. And at this point, it becomes really hard to get any sort of accommodation. And if you do get an accommodation, it's kind of like, well, the same kind of accommodation that the KKK would get, and nothing for social benefit. It's just that you can have your own rallies in your own heads and in your own homes, and we won't, as long as you don't hurt anybody directly or whatever. And it's just not the role. And what it does is it takes the religious freedom side of things, which this is what's so hard about this, Warren, is that religious freedom was built into the nation constitutionally as a fundamental good, as a prerequisite to long-term success, as a ingredient to America's flourishing. Right? And so this takes religious freedom and it immediately turns it into something bad. So not only is it limited, but it actually goes from being a positive to being a negative, kind of in the same sort of category as, again, white supremacy.
Yeah, you talk about that being ironic. It reminds me a bit of the C.S. Lewis essay, Men Without Chest, where they say, we bid the geldings go be fruitful. I think that's the language that Lewis used in that essay. And I think this, in some ways, is an example of that. We are taking away, as you rightly said, one of our first freedoms, the freedom of religion, and we expect that not to have some negative impact on the liberty that we enjoy in this country, and it absolutely will. One of the ironies in this week's news, John, I mentioned earlier that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has come out in favor of the bill. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce historically has been an organization that has been against more government regulation, has been an organization that often asks for what it calls regulatory relief. It's no doubt that the Equality Act, if it ever passes, is going to place tremendous burdens on corporations. So it's even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is jumping on the politically correct bandwagon, even in this case if it's against their own self-interest.
Well, and to be clear, Warren, that's one of the reasons that I think that this has gone from being a long shot, a non-starter, to within the realm of possibility. So it came out of committee in the House. No one was surprised by that. It's going to go up for a House vote, be given the strong Democratic majority in the House. It's thought that it'll pass. It goes to the Senate. Now, McConnell's got to bring it to the floor, and then you basically need 5 GOP senators to vote for it. And this is why the Chamber of Commerce endorsement of the Equality Act kind of raises the stakes, because the Chamber of Commerce, being about free market, being about less government regulation and so on, they financially support campaigns for a lot of U.S. senators, and most of them are GOP. Most of them are Republicans. They traditionally support that sort of folks. So they've got a little bit of leverage now, and the rumor is that Susan Collins will be one of the sponsors in the Senate of the Equality Act. She's a Republican, so now you've got 1 down, only 4 to go. You get 4 more GOP senators, and then this thing goes from being kind of a possibility to a live option. And so what needs to happen now is we need Christians, and we talked about this on Friday's Breakpoint. We need Christians to call their senators, to call their congressional leaders. If you are a businessman or a business leader, one of the things we need you to do is to pick up the phone and put pressure on the Chamber of Commerce. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who do I call? How do I call it? Good news. Our friends at the Alliance Defending Freedom have put together a document that sums up. Here's who you call. When you call them, here's what you say. And you can download that. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. And I mean, it is as easy as possible, and it is a big deal. We need to put pressure on our elected officials. We need to put pressure on the Chamber of Commerce. You talked about irony, and there's one more thing we got to say about this. We just got to say this about this. One of the interesting parts of this whole conversation was an article that came out this past week in Real Politics, and it was co-authored. In fact, before I tell you who it was co-authored by, The opening line was, "What on earth could bring together a radical feminist and a leader of a Christian women's organization?" And what I mean by that is the chairman of the board of a group called Women's Liberation Front. I mean, it sounds like a South American kind of militia, right?
Right.
The Women's Liberation Front, the chairman of the board, and Penny Nance, who's the president of Concerned Women for America, came together and co-authored an op-ed. Now, what could bring them together? And their answer was the Equality Act. Why? Because the Equality Act now has been at some level hijacked, or a group that's kind of jumped on the bandwagon of this momentum is the transgender movement. The transgender movement is a movement that will allow men to assume rights and privileges that have been set aside for women to bring about equality. So this is the irony, is when you talk about Title IX and scholarship dollars and money going for female athletes, and you talk about business grants going specifically to women and so on. Now the transgender movement wants men to be able to claim those rights by claiming that they're women. And now you have two women's groups, one super conservative, a Christian group, and the other a radical feminist group, joining together and saying the Equality Act is bad for women. And that's something that's a talking point that really needs to get out there, because it's absolutely true. The feminist groups have fought for years saying, look, men are given privileges that women aren't. We need to have rights and privileges set aside for women. We need equal pay. We need business grants. We need opportunities. We need hand-ups, all that sort of stuff. And now the transgender movement comes in and basically opens access to all of those things for men on the mere condition that they claim to be women. This is kind of like cinema you can't make up.
That's right. Well, in the LGBT world, the L is fighting with the T. Sometimes, John, in our editorial meetings, we call that the snake is eating its own tail. It's kind of a story, and this is a pretty straightforward example of that.
Well, it is. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Warren, I think we got an email saying, you guys talk a lot about pro-life stuff. And the answer is yes. And the reason is there's a lot of pro-life stuff to talk about over and over and over. And this was no different. This week started with, last Saturday, the Alive from New York event, where Abby Johnson, who was the former Planned Parenthood director featured in the movie, whose story was featured in the movie Unplanned, was the keynote speaker of an event that Focus on the Family hosted in downtown New York City. Jumbotron portrayed a 4D ultrasound. Actually, she wasn't the keynote speaker. Her unborn child, which is her 8th child, was put up on the 4D ultrasound for everyone to see. It was a great event. And then you and I have been talking about the heartbeat bills. We've got one in Ohio, Alabama. I think there's one more, blanking out on which one it is, maybe Mississippi. But Georgia has had one on the governor's desk waiting to sign. You and I were both like, what's taking him so long? The Ohio governor signed it right away. Why not the Georgia governor? Well, we heard from some elected officials there in the state and said, look, this governor did this, he led this, he pushed this. He's the reason there is a heartbeat bill that is now in law, and he wants to make sure he's ready for the legal challenges. And that's, of course, the secret to these heartbeat bills. They're not end games in and of themselves, but I think there's a real thought that these could be the cases that go to the Supreme Court that challenge Roe v. Wade.
Well, that's right, John. And Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, good for him for finally signing it. And you're right. I've sort of teased him for the last few weeks, like, what's taken so long? But I think you were right and fair to sort of offer the counterbalance to my teasing, which is that, no, he's not been sleeping or on the sidelines. He's been strategic. He's been working in the background. And we do talk about life at the state level a good bit, and we have for the last few months, because I really believe that in the last 40 years, we've come to a critical moment in that 40-year history, that for so long, at least legislatively speaking, the life issue was not in play. But it really is in play now with 2 new conservative justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, with these heartbeat bills passing at the state level in the 4 states that we were just talking about, and likely to happen in other states. I mean, we finally, and again, you don't want to get cocky, what was it? Han Solo said to Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, "Don't get cocky, kid." You don't want to get cocky about any of these issues. You don't want to take your foot off the gas. But there's a real chance for serious legislative and judicial action in the foreseeable future, and it's something that we as pro-lifers need to be paying particular attention to now and into the near future.
And right therein, folks, is the difference between Warren Smith and myself. Warren uses Star Wars analogies. And earlier this week on a webinar that Warren and I did on a new book on the Manhattan Declaration on Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty, I used an illustration from the NBA playoffs. And there you go. That's the difference between Warren and me. Who's the nerd? I'll let you guys decide. But I was mentioning, and I think this is the analogy. I was mentioning there was a game in the first round of the NBA playoffs with the Golden State Warriors, and honestly, I can't even remember who they were playing, but they were up by 35 or something like that at halftime, and they did what a lot of teams do, which is they just start drifting and they take their foot off the gas. And I think that's a real fear, and that's one of the things we've been talking about over and over and over. People sense this sort of momentum. They hear about these laws being passed. They're like, that's great, and oh yeah, Trump's going to fix this problem with his Supreme Court nominations and so on, and we take our foot off the gas. And now's the time to accelerate. It really is. Now's the time to lock in. It may be the time to focus more on the state level than on the federal level, so that there are these cases that can trickle up to the Supreme Court. But then, by and large, too, let's repeat something that we say, and it's a quote from our pro-life leader friends like Scott Klusendorf, that we don't want abortion to be illegal only. We do want it to be illegal, but we actually ultimately want it to be unthinkable. We want it to be in the same category as slavery, where people can't even imagine themselves participating in something like this. And so that's really what we want. And there's so much critical happening on the life movement just right now. I mean, it really is something. It is the time to kind of lock in. And one of the ways you can lock in, by the way, is by continuing to learn. The last line of the Manhattan Declaration that was written 10 years ago is, we will always render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but we can never render to Caesar what belongs to God. And 10 years ago, abortion was one way in which Caesar was grasping something that didn't belong to it, and that was the definition of preborn life. And now we have a chance. Now it's at least in the realm of possibility. It's not inevitable by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of things to overcome, but to grasp that back out of Caesar's hands is an opportunity, and we got to go deeper on it. One way you can do that, by the way, is this new book that I just mentioned. It's called Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty: What Belongs to God, What Belongs to Caesar. It's a collection of essays written by folks like Johnny Erickson Tata and Randy Alcorn and Rick Warren and Russell Moore and Andrew Walker and Frederica Matthews Green and Dr. Timothy George and Dr. Robbie George. It was co-edited by myself and my friend Dr. David Dockery, the president of Trinity International University. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We'll tell you how to get a copy of that book. In fact, we'll mail you a copy for any donation made to Breakpoint or the Colson Center this month. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
We're back on Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, along with Warren Smith. Warren, I want to go ahead and punt this topic right to you. You have had a long history in the Boy Scouts, and we've talked about the Boy Scouts. We've talked about how do we want to say this? This isn't the best time in their history. No. Struggling. And it has been for a while, facing serious financial problems, completely changed who they let in and why and all of that sort of stuff. But there's some other developments too, and I know this is near and dear to your heart.
Well, it is. Yeah, the Boy Scouts, an amazing American institution. We talk at the Colson Center a lot about the mediating institutions, what Alexis de Tocqueville described in Democracy in America more than 150 years ago, that the greatness of America is not at the top or the bottom, not the rugged individualist or not in places like Washington or New York or L.A., but in the middle where there are churches and families and civic organizations and neighbors loving neighbors and solving problems together. And I think the Boy Scouts, though it was never an explicitly Christian organization, was a part of that civil society that brought so much to American life. But as you say, it's fallen on hard times. There's been a great deal of trouble within the Boy Scouts over the last 5 to 8 years in particular. And just this week, a story broke about the so-called perversion files of the Boy Scouts. Since the 1920s, keep in mind the Boy Scouts were founded in 1910, and since the 1920s, since almost the beginning of the organization, Scouts have understood that there are sexual predators out there and they needed to be kept away from boys. And so they have kept files on men that they suspected might be child abusers, and they've tried to keep them out of the Boy Scouts. So in the early days, 20s, 30s, and 40s, keeping these files may have been a good thing. It may have been driven by the best of intentions. But the laws have changed over the years. Secrecy crept into the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts lost its moral moorings. In other words, it didn't quite know what to do with men with same-sex attractions, to the point where now it even allows men with same-sex attractions to be leaders within the organization, which just goes to show you how far they've come. And this file of 8,000 individuals, at least 12,000 victims that the Boy Scouts has been maintaining, is now becoming a part of the public record. It's become the subject of lawsuits. It's probably going to result in tremendous financial settlements against the Boy Scouts. The Scouts have already announced that they were suing their insurance carriers. They've got at least 6 lawsuits going themselves against their insurance carriers. And they said that financially they are exploring all options, including the possibility of a strategic bankruptcy to sort of save themselves financially. So this is a huge deal for the Boy Scouts. It's a tragic situation because we're talking, as I said, at least 12,000 victims of sexual abuse at the hands of Scout leaders over the years. And, I guess, John, as you said, I've had a long association with the Boy Scouts, but I must say that my association has largely ended with the Boy Scouts, and I'm very honored to be a part now of an organization called Trail Life USA, which is an alternative to the Boy Scouts. And when people ask me today about scouting, because they know of my involvement with scouting, I've written several books on scouting, as a matter of fact, I tell them that if my kids were Scout age today, they would be a part of Trail Life USA.
Well, any predictions in the future here? I mean, what's going to happen to the Boy Scouts? Are we seeing the demise? I mean, is this a demise or is this a decline?
Well, there's no question it's a decline. Yogi Berra once said that predictions are dangerous, especially predictions about the future. So I want to be really, really careful not to be too definitive about the future of the Boy Scouts. But, John, we've already seen a dramatic decline in the Boy Scouts. I mean, there was a time in the 1960s when there were more than 5 million men and boys involved in the Boy Scouts. And you've got to understand that in the 1960s, there were less than 200 million people in this country. Now we've got 320 million people, and we probably have less than 3 million men and boys in the Boy Scouts. I've heard numbers as low as 2 million of folks that are active. There's already been serious financial troubles. There's been big layoffs and consolidations of Scout councils, the selling of Scout camps, the hard assets over the last 10 or 15 years. So there's no question that the Scouts are in decline. They've been in decline for decades. Whether this will spell the actual end of scouting, it's hard to say. I mean, because you've got to say that even at 2 million men and boys, it's a pretty large organization, and it has a budget in the tens of millions of dollars and assets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So that kind of an organization doesn't go away overnight, but I do think that it is fair to say that the influence, the positive influence that the Boy Scouts had on cities, towns, and communities all across America for decades, for nearly a century, will never be what it was.
Well, just quickly here before we sign off, Warren, it was also a week of loss. The great Warren Wiersbe, author of those terrific Bee books, passed away. Another just a tremendous life. Jean Vanier, and I apologize if I said that wrong, of the Liarch community. He's just a remarkable guy. We talked about him on Breakpoint months ago, and also passed away, meant a lot to a lot of folks. And of course, Rachel Held Evans, who was a larger-than-life figure in the American context over the last decade or so, tragically passed away at age 37.
Yeah, remarkable losses, all three of them. As you said, Warren Wiersbe, an author, wrote over 150 books, and Jean Vanier of the Les Arches communities, he founded 150 communities in 38 countries that were focused on giving dignity to the disabled, an issue that is very close to the heart of the Colson Center, and we would be remiss to not recognize that. And of course, John, you had a personal relationship with Rachel Held Evans.
I did, and with her family, and just really grieving for that loss. I know that there was an incident with an article that I wrote this week that was very public, and enough has been said. I'm not going to say anything more other than to say that my prayers are with Dan, with her husband Dan, with her two young children, with Peter and Robin and Amanda. Her parents and her sister, and all those that are affected. A lot of people have felt that loss quite acutely, and if there's one thing we can say, it's that life is short. We are but dust, and to dust we will return. And death is imminent, and our thoughts should always have that in view, that there's an eternity beyond this life that has to be considered whenever we think about the best way to live today. Amen. Well, thanks for joining us at Breakpoint this week. You've been listening here with John Stonestreet and Warren Smith. Come to breakpoint.org, and we'll link you to the various resources that we mentioned on today's program. Just click on the button there on the homepage that says Resources Mentioned on the Radio and Podcast. And you can also find out how to pick up a copy of Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty, What Belongs to God, What Belongs to Caesar. Thanks for joining us.